There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
And of course, you both know that I heavily edit the videos, so don't worry about interruptions or taking times out or coughing or anything like that.
But
So we can
if I happen to get a good line, please don't cut it out, okay?
Oh no, I'll move it to the very front. Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn Breeze Books, and this is one of the most special videos I think I've ever done for my channel. I am here together with two wonderful Western Canadian writers, Sharon Butala and David Carpenter. I have interviewed them both separately many times on my channel, but I believe this is the first time, and I should have asked them before I started to record. I think this is the first time they've appeared together in an interview or on a panel. Maybe not on a panel, but in an interview, certainly on YouTube. So, Sharon and Dave, welcome.
Hi,
Thanks.
Shawn.
Terrific to be here and to finally have gotten this organized.
We've been planning this for a hot minute. Sharon, most recently, is the author of Leaving Wisdom, which came out in 2023, and David, most recently, of the memoir I Never Met a Rattlesnake I Didn't Like, which came out in 2022. Both of you write personally memoir and also incorporate autobiographical elements in your fiction. Would you riff on that for a few minutes? What are the benefits and pitfalls of the autobiographical approach in your writing?
Do you want to go first, Sharon?
I was going to say the same thing to you.
Oh,
We should have a coin to put here.
Is there paper rock?
yeah. Well, I think about the books that I've written, and no matter how over the top or outlandish or my characters are, even evil characters, there's always a bit of Carpenter in there. I think getting bits of your own life helps to authenticate things and helps to give you a kind of ground to work from. I remember once I wrote a character who was not only schizoid but really evil, and I could still find things about myself that you could find in him. So, having said that, I very rarely write an autobiographical story or novel, even if it's a portrait of the artist as a young nerd, as one of my novels, Banjo Lessons, was. The guy that I created to be the sort of artist, he lives in the places where Carpenter has lived, but I think his life is much more interesting than mine. We'll leave it at that.
Well, for me, I feel that you can only know what you know. I'm not a person who really invents a lot, except maybe in plot terms, but my characters are people I know, even if they're amalgams. And there's obviously going to be some of myself in them. I'm thinking of two books I'm reading right now. One is by Paulette Jiles, and it's very much a male story. It's of a big, powerful guy on a quest. And the more I read the book, it was definitely a male story, the more I thought that it didn't ring like a guy story, even though it was, because it was written by this incredibly sensitive, very gifted writer woman. And I thought that was pretty interesting that she couldn't erase that and become fully a male with the real violence, the gutty violence, that you read in those books. And the other one that I'm reading is I actually paid for this one. I usually use library books, but Joyce Carol Oates, something like 48 clues about the murder of my sister or something, or disappearance of my sister. And the main character is a horrible person. She's so horrible, I'm not sure I can finish reading that book. I cannot see myself giving over who I am to that degree to write a character who is ghastly awful. So one time I was speaking at an erotology conference at Saint something or other, St. John's or something in New Brunswick in Fredericton, and was talking about how the critics said about my book, The Perfection of the Morning, that it was self-involved. I still laugh when I think about it. It's a memoir. And I had to say, well, duh. That was my critical
That
response.
pretty much says it, doesn't it? Duh.
So I can't stop myself. And I now, because I'm old and I get to say things I would never have said before. Well, I didn't know them before. I've been saying to certain writer friends that I'm beginning to think that my gift is that very thing, the mining of the self and turning it into literature. So
I would agree with that assessment. Absolutely. This is maybe a banal question, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you ever gotten into trouble or had friends or family come after you thinking that they were badly portrayed or fearing that they were about to be portrayed in your fiction or your memoirs?
Yes.
oh, really?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
dear.
Some of my earliest stories were fairly autobiographical. I guess I could say that because I didn't have the confidence to trust my imagination as much as I do now. And so, yeah, my very first short story, it was in Saturday Night, and a number of people recognized themselves in the story. And I was about to apologize to one who threatened all kinds of things.
Oh, no.
This was a story called Protection about an all-Jewish football team who played some rough guys from the wrong side of the track, and there's a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment in it. Anyhow, I was about to write this letter of apology, and a lawyer phoned me up. It's the lawyer who married Earl Burney late in life. I forget her name. Anyway, she says, "You were going to send it, or you have sent it?" I said, "I was going to send it." She said, "Don't send it," because I would have opened the door to a massive lawsuit.
I
So,
see.
yeah.
Oh,
But the older I get, the fewer recognizable characters you could possibly find in my work.
hmm. Oh, well, I was thinking the same thing about Joyce Carol Oates in that novel I just talked about, that she's written so many books that she no longer is the person who writes those books. She's distanced herself so much that that's why she can write this horrible character. I think it's just a thought anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, has this ever happened to me? What happened to
Yes,
David?
anything like that.
No, the worst thing that happened was my older sister said to me, I used to send her my stories, and she said, I knew that day was coming. I dreaded it, and I was afraid to turn the page when I was reading it for what would be on it. But she didn't say, don't write it. And my mother said, I give you something to the effect, I give you permission to say whatever you want about me. You can say I was Attila the Hun if you want. So
Good for her.
That's right.
Uh,
You wrote about moving down to a ranch in southern Saskatchewan and living many years with your husband, Peter Butala. I don't want to come right out and ask you what Peter thought of you writing a memoir, but you also wrote, if you want to comment on that, that would be very interesting. But also that you wrote about not really finding your people down there and not really connecting with the people that were there. So did you ever get any blowback from any of them?
no, but I have a new memoir coming out in the fall, and maybe I'll get some from that one. I'm not quite so forgiving. And of course, I feel guilty about every single thing that is in at least this new memoir. I lie in bed at night. I wake up at 3 in the morning and think, oh my God, I can't publish this book. It's whining, and then I wake up in the morning and I think I can do that if I want to. I will do that.
night thoughts versus day thoughts.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you have those kinds of polar opposite thoughts, night versus day, Dave?
I do. Yeah, I'm chronically bad that way. At night, when I don't sleep, I'm very good at envisaging the very worst, right down to the apocalypse. But in daytime, I'm a different person. Is that the beginnings of schizophrenia, do you think?
I think it's just perhaps the creative's cross to bear.
Yes, you see, if we were doing this at night, I'd be wanting to talk about the dark night of the soul. but I'm
Well,
feeling too tearful today.
that'll be part two.
I want to hear that
Um,
one.
this is a tongue-in-cheek question. Have you ever found yourself in each other's fiction, or have you ever written about each other in your fiction?
I want to say I'm really insulted that I haven't appeared in anything that you wrote.
Yes, it's true. He hasn't. Well, I don't know David that well. We've both been around together for going on 50 years, in the writing community.
But this is the first time we've lived in the same city.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. I was always on the ranch, 5 hours from Saskatoon and almost 5 from Regina. And I would rush into one city or the other for events like the SWG conference, or maybe because I'd been asked to speak or something. But I never hung around and socialized very much. That was rare. The one time, do you remember, David, when we were together? But you were teaching at the university still then, and we went to the convent and the old hospital in name of the town,
Munster.
No, French town.
Oh, a French town.
Cadillac.
I remember that.
Not Cadillac. Down there.
It wasn't Cadillac, but it was a very dusty small town, and it was around Halloween, I think. You and Lorna were starting a folklore magazine of some kind.
Oh yeah, we talked about. Of course, we never did it.
But I want just to tell you, at that meeting, I think it was, where I maybe first met you, you read a chapter about an old man, an old rancher dying. And I think it might have been from Country of the Heart. Do you remember that?
I think it was The Gates of the Sun, which would have been my second published novel.
Okay, but it was just an amazing reading. It was really an amazing reading.
Thank you.
Oh, God, it was wonderful.
And you know what I
wow.
remember about you? You see, we were both in Jack Hodgins. Is it Hodgkins or it's Hodgins?
Hodgins, yes.
In his senior prose group. I think
Oh.
Van Vegemudre was in there.
Yeah.
Elise Poirot, me. A man was sitting across the table from us, and he was reading, and he read a sentence, and David said, very, very politely, I remember that, he was being very careful, and he said something to the effect that the writer should change the sentence in a certain way. And I just thought, oh my God, that's how you do it. And the writer, of course, he wrote it down. It was a case of a writer writing about, like, somebody walked across the room for some purpose, and David took the purpose and turned it into a verb instead, so that it dropped the walk in favor of the and I thought, whoa, learned something new here today.
Yes, that is.
But I never told him.
Well,
you don't know how competitive writers are.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. So tell me more about this. Was this a writing class with Jack Hodgins?
It was a brief retreat, maybe a
Oh, I
week,
see.
maybe a weekend, and it was very jolly. I remember that.
You were teaching, as I recall, and you'd registered, but we were only able to come for the weekend because you had class.
Okay, that
And
would
I
be
was there the whole week.
Okay.
And it was the Southwest Saskatchewan Writers something or other that was a brand project, I think.
Yeah.
And Lorna Crozier had been hired as coordinator and of the whole business. And she and I guess Patrick, who was obviously there with her, Patrick Lane, the poet, set up this conference and ran it. And there were a number of writing groups, poetry, two fiction, prose,
Yeah.
and nonfiction. Although I just remember Lois Simi being there, not
Yes,
Margaret.
yes.
Anyway, we had a good
We're talking
time.
about we're talking about like the 1970s, something somewhere in there.
Early 80s.
I
Early
guess
80s.
about 1980, 81 maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, and Lane and Crozier and Lois Simi had heard about this very first story of mine on Saturday night, and I guess I must have acted pretty chuffed about it. Anyway, I came down, and they had a very sober look on their faces, and they took me aside, and they said, "We're so sorry." And I'm not sorry. I'm glad I wrote it. No, you must have heard by now. I said, what? Saturday night, he said, it's going under.
Oh, yeah.
They won't publish anything anymore. And I believed them. Idiot that I am. I believed them. And then they had the greatest laugh at my expense.
Oh,
Oh, so it was before Saturday night actually ended.
Well before it ended.
Well,
yeah.
before. Okay.
Never trust writers. They're a bunch of worms in the ditch, if you ask me.
Well, I will ask you to say more about that. But first, tell me, who were the influential authors that you read or that inspired you to write or that you felt that you were kind of following in the footsteps of? Sharon, why don't we start with you?
Oh, okay. I think probably Dostoevsky. I started reading him when I was in grade 12 and was utterly clueless as to what it was about, but I was hugely impressed and awed and kind of scared, by his work. Later on, well, among influences, I wrote this down because I knew I wouldn't remember. And now I seem to, well, wouldn't you know it? Oh, no, there it is. Doris Lessing. Certainly
Okay.
later, Hemingway for a long time. I just was stunned by what he was doing and how original it was. That was all I could come up with. But since then, of course, once Sebald started publishing, well, he became a hero. Alice Munro, very, very much so. But as I keep saying to people, you can't imitate Alice Munro, no matter how hard you try. You have to have her mind, and who's got her mind? At the moment, I'm so incredibly impressed by Paulette Jiles, who was a person who used to be around.
Yes,
And
she's from the States originally.
yeah, and she's back living in Texas outside of San Antonio, I think.
I heard, though, that she and that big bruiser that she was married to broke up. Did you hear
Oh.
that?
Oh, well, I never met him, never
Oh.
knew anything like that. I just,
Yeah. I'm just wondering if this novel you were describing by her was not a way, it was perhaps a way of exercising this guy.
could be, except that this guy is kind of a modern day saint.
Well, that wouldn't be the one.
Right.
Okay.
Well, the last time I saw Paulette Giles was probably in the early 90s at a conference in Calgary before it was called WordFest, when it was just the Calgary Festival of Authors or whatever. And she was sitting at the same table I was with some other people, and one of those evening performances where more famous writers are doing readings. And I spoke with her a little bit then, and then we just vanished out of each other's lives. I'm very impressed with Sebald, who is kind of like an opposite to Alice Munro. But whatever it was, I think what impressed me so very much was not only his agility with the language and with moving around in time and telling his stories through different voices without you're actually noticing. I was also just absolutely blown away by the temper, the tone of his writings in the four most famous of his books. And I studied and studied to try to figure out how he achieved that. Not that it's a tone that I would rest in. I don't have the Holocaust and the Second World War, and I'm not a German. So my sorrows are very different, and I think need a different approach. Jhumpa Lahiri, wow, is she good? And she belongs to the more modern school of writing than I do. I always have to preface things like that by saying, well, I'm 84 years old. By the time this book I'm talking about is published, I'll be 85. And I come out of the school of humanism, and I have always been a realist writer, for which, can you reach those books, David? I've only got two of them. I just found out there's a volume 3, which I dread to approach. These are David's. He was the editor of these.
Yes.
And there's a
I
third
have
one.
volume 1.
And okay, I confess, I go to the index and look up my name. And then
Well,
I
you're
go
on
through
page
the book.
one, actually. You're on page one.
I don't think that one's in the index. And I read everything all these various writers said, usually briefly. And I have the feeling going through them, oh my God, they hate my work. They think I'm a terrible writer. They're dismissing me, but they're doing it politely. However, there's a story there because I can tell you that was not always the case. And then I get to George Melnick. I don't remember. Is he volume 2?
Probably
Oh,
volume
it
2.
doesn't matter. I'm not going to read it. I
Sure.
just and he mentions me in the same way that he mentions these other writers. I think the writers of the Southwest, maybe. And he says that it's unfair for all these critics to judge the work of a realist by postmodern standards.
Good point.
And I said, yes, George.
That's fascinating. Oh my goodness. We could probably talk for 45 minutes about what you've just raised in the last 3 minutes. George Melnick, didn't he write the Alberta literary history?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned him quite a bit in the foreword, which I think we all reread for this to talk about stuff. David, tell us
Sure,
about your
yeah.
influences.
I was a late bloomer. My first literary experience was as a 11-year-old child was Little Lulu, a comic book that was so funny. I can still remember the plots. But I became an obsessed reader about the age of 22. And I first tried D.H. Laurence and Hemingway for different reasons. But the one that hit me the strongest was James Joyce, especially his stories in his first novel,
Oh, yeah.
Porter. He hit me very hard. He had a way not only of getting the good old mot juste, just the right word for the right description or something like that, but he had a way of talking about things and people where he would get the essence of them, the whatness of them. The way he deployed his language in that enterprise was amazing. And then when I went to the States for 2 years to do a master's degree, I switched. I'm a perfidious reader. I go from hero to hero to hero. I discovered Faulkner for the first time, and he just about took the top of my head off. So five
Well, I
or
was
six of
wondering
his
what
books.
happened.
Now, that was cruel.
Yeah, well, I'm one to talk.
I know, I understand. But Faulkner was a huge influence on me. And then when I came back from the States, I yearned to read more Canadian stuff. So I remember the two Peggies hit me very, very hard for very different reasons, Atwood and Margaret Laurence. I got to know Laurence quite well, actually. She was not only a superb writer at her best, but she was also a wonderful storyteller. I kind of yearned for her to be my next door neighbor. And there's a realist that I've never ever forgotten. And if I just stuck with those four, I think that's enough for a while.
Yes, I just reread Margaret Lawrence's The Stone Angel, and it's just what an incredible work. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful book.
Yeah.
I reread it too when I was working on my book of short stories about old women.
Oh, yeah,
Ah,
absolutely. Hagar Shipley. The only Paulette Giles I've read is News of the World, which was maybe 2 or 3 novels back, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It's the only thing I've read by her, and I absolutely loved it.
She's a wonderfully gifted writer, but if we have time and get around to talking about postmodernism versus realism and that sort of thing, this latest novel that I read, 23, is called Chenneville. Well, English pronunciation, Chenneville, which is the
Right.
surname of the hero. And I was very disappointed in the ending because she had caught me so up in plot that I knew she could do better than that. And I was baffled, wandering around, wondering about. And then I realized here's where postmodernism creeps in. But that's another story. I won't go on.
But let's bookmark that and come back. And Dave's forward to volume 1 of the literary history of Saskatchewan is a good place to situate your reminiscing about your contemporaries. So there's all kinds of names here. And like I say, Sharon Butala is the first writer mentioned in the second paragraph of that forward. And that's not the only time she comes up. And you've already mentioned several, Lorna Crozier et al. But get started on who you were writing in the mid stuff when you first came onto the scene?
Certainly, Patrick Lane and Lorna Crozier were very big in my life back then, and Jack Hodgins was a terrific teacher. But the very first one was our Croach, who really challenged me. And I remember thinking, I was working on a novel at the time, and I was thinking, my God, I'm really dead center here. These people are going to hear from me. They're going to worship whatever, all that vain stuff, desperate vanity. I wanted to believe I could write. And I remember one day early on at Fort Sam, Croach held my manuscript as though it were a plate of sandwiches or something like that. And he said, for instance, why does she say that? Well, who is she really? What does she like to wear? What does she, who are her, and a lot of questions like that. And I said, I don't know. He takes the manuscript and goes, whack, on the table. And it was a resounding whack. And he says, Carpenter, you've got to know this stuff. And I could have walked away wounded and self-pitying and all that sort of stuff. But I think, knowing as I do, he did it out of love. He needed to throttle me into some kind of awareness of what the writer does. It was I guess, tough love, maybe.
Yes.
But I certainly listened to every word he ever uttered in our presence in that first year course. It wouldn't be, I mean, a senior writer's course, I guess it was. Robert Crowe was a great teacher. Hodgins
Oh,
was,
I was thinking, who is this Croach? I've never heard of this Croach, but of course, it's Robert Croach, the
Robert,
Alberta novelist.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
A
I
good writer, good
studied.
poet as well.
What's his most famous novel?
The Stud Horse Man.
The Stud Horse Man. I studied that in a Western Canadian literature course, and who was that professor? Oh, that was you, Dave Carpenter. Yeah, that was, and I loved it so much. Yeah. Did you get, what was the word you used? Whack? Did you get whacked like that, Sharon, by any of your teachers?
Oh, I'm sure I did, but nothing stands out when I think about it now. The thing that I would remember about Jack Hodgins, and although I was never taught by Robert Croach, I met him a few times, was that both those men were very kind. They were not just good writers and good teachers, they were kind people, and they treated their writing students with respect, except for when they threw your book.
There were some exceptions, but you're absolutely right. They were both very kind.
Yeah. So when
Okay, editing Shawn here. You're about to see a really fascinating gossipy anecdote. It's not gossip because at least one of the people in this interview witnessed it firsthand, but they mentioned the name of a writer who came to Saskatchewan. So this writer did not live in Saskatchewan, from outside of the province, and he was a bit of a jerk. And we joke in a few minutes about, oh, he's long dead, so we're not going to get sued, talking about what a a-hole he was. And then as I was editing it, I googled it, and this writer is still very much alive, although quite aged, and probably would never find this little anecdote on YouTube. But to err on the side of caution, we have bleeped the writer's name.
showed up at Fort Sam, not that I was ever there, apparently by all accounts there was a scandal, and chiefly it concerned the fact that he wasn't kind when you say.
That's right. Yes.
It was brutal.
It was rather disconcertingly amorous towards some of his younger female students, and he got nowhere whatsoever. And he said, "This place is dying of celibacy."
Oh. What an awful human being.
Oh yeah, he was eminently awful. Yeah,
and eminently thought of.
And is no longer with us, right? So we're not going to have a lawyer involved in protecting you from what you just said about him. He's dead, isn't he?
I don't know.
I I think he is, and you can't defame the dead. So there. Not in Canada anyway.
I'm quite sure he's no longer with us.
And I never met him. His presence at Fort Sam was significant enough in all the wrong ways that the CBC radio, which at that time used to actually have literary programs, had writers who'd been present at Fort San on the program to talk about how awful the experience was.
Oh, they weren't worried about suing them, so that's good. Now I'm getting mixed up. Sharon, did I ask you about your contemporaries yet? I don't think so.
No, you didn't.
Please go ahead.
Well, Alice Munro is a contemporary, although I think she's 10 years older than I am. Margaret Atwood is a year or half a year older than I am. So she'd be
Yeah, I believe
85
she
by
had her
now.
85th birthday just the other day,
Yeah.
maybe, or this month or
Yeah.
something.
As for, well, David's a contemporary, but you're younger than I am too, I think. I was born in 1940.
I was 41.
Oh, well, that's not enough to matter.
No, doesn't matter.
I'm mixing you up with somebody else I must have looked up. Croach was older than me by, I think, a fair bit. Jeffersell, that crowd that used to be the sort of clique of the important Saskatchewan writers were pretty much all of them my contemporaries. Lorna is 8 to 10 years younger, though, and Patrick was horrified to discover that I was older than him. Would you believe this? I was having a literary dinner at our house on the hay farm in East End with Patrick and Lorna as special guests, and I rounded up another 8 people, so we were 10 at the table. And that was when Patrick discovered I was slightly older than him, and he was annoyed by that. He had decided to be the grand old man, and it's kind of hard when the grand old lady is there. But my difference was that I always lived on the hay farm and the ranch during the years that we're talking about mostly. And as I said, it was a long way to go to the city, and I only went for special reasons. And I would always have to stay overnight, and I would try to stay 2 days and go home on the third day. So I was never really a part of the, help me out here, David, the socializing, the
literary circle.
Yeah, or the literary mafia of Saskatchewan, you might say.
The mafia. Yeah.
I was never part of it.
It helped me a lot that I was living in Saskatoon, where half of them lived,
Yeah.
and an easy drive to Regina, where the other half of them lived.
Yeah.
Except, of course, Moose Jaw was very important.
Yeah, it was, but most of those Moose Jaw writers, except for Gary Highland and Robert Curry, and a couple of others, had moved to either Saskatoon or Regina, mostly Regina. Barb Persia. Anyway, not being part of that group was difficult for me. Hard to filter your way into a group that's very engaged with each other and familiar with each other, and not only wrote together, discussed writing together, but had parties together and all the rest of it. I simply was not ever a part of that. And of course, when I went back home again, I wasn't part of the local culture either. But by virtue of being married to my husband, I wound up in all kinds of places that nobody else who ever moved there from the city with a city partner would ever have been part of, which is how I got to write my books. It was so fascinating. But then the other thing was that I couldn't get no respect when I went to the city, because people in Saskatchewan at that time had this prejudice against rural people as tending to be uneducated, unsophisticated, and certainly not intellectuals or well-read people. And I kept fighting that stereotype because I was as well educated as most of those writers, not all of them. Dave has a PhD, Jeff Wurcell had one, and I had undergrad degrees and one chapter left of my master's thesis to write when I said had enough of this and married Peter. Anyway, it was always difficult for me, but I have always also thought that it might have been an advantage. And I learned this one time when I was in Fredericton teaching at the Maritime Writers Workshop, and was sitting at a table at lunch with that wonderful writer who died just out of the blue, Stephen, was it Huyton or was it the other Stephen?
Oh, Stephen Huyton, yeah.
Yeah, he was sitting there. So I'm sitting there, we're all eating lunch, we're all being fellow types, and they start talking Toronto gossip about writers. And I found out all kinds of things just sitting there listening that I had no idea about and was not involved in, although I was fascinated because I'm nothing if not a gossip too. And I realized, though, that when all this stuff was going on among the writing groups in the various cities of Canada, I was sitting way out there in the middle of nowhere by myself and was free to form my own ideas about literature, about writing, and about what our Canadian writing culture needed about the West.
Mm. My own story is, as as a city boy, I'm a city boy whose heart is in the country.
Yes, I know that.
I decided, well, I may as well get a master's degree and I may as well get a PhD because there's nothing else to do, and I could get a good job. But in the summer of 1976, I went to Texas to do research on something, and it was very boring. I had to read all day, and then I'd come home in the sweltering heat, and there was nothing to do. I started writing letters. And one of the long letters I'd written to, I guess it was an ex-girlfriend, I realized it probably make a story. And so I started every night for something like 3 weeks writing this story, and every weekend. And after the 3 weeks were up, I had a 69-page novella finished in first draft. I hasten to say it is almost the worst novella ever written in the history of modern languages, and nobody ever saw it. But the excitement that came out of writing this novella, creating characters, was it was like being struck by lightning. It was almost a religious experience. And from then on, I had to unlearn all the things I learned about writing, the pull up the ass style of writing for learned magazines. I was in full flight from academia at least every summer, and eventually I quit way early so that I could be a full-time writer. So I guess it was nice to be an academic because I could teach Joyce, I could teach Faulkner, I could teach Margaret, Laurence, and that was nice. I could abide by their books and delve into them, but I didn't start writing with any kind of purpose until I was 34 years old.
Yeah.
A late bloomer.
Well, me too. 44 when I published my first book.
Really?
Yeah.
My first one came out in 1985, so I was 45 years old when my first book came out. Yeah.
Same as,
Very similar.
I published one in 84. That was my first novel. And then in 85, I published the second one, which was short stories that I'd written before the novel that had been published.
Oh, we're very close in
Yeah,
that regard. Yeah.
Do you have an experience akin to Dave's about being almost having a religious experience with an early piece of writing where you just realized this is what you were meant to do, Sharon?
Well, as I have said about 75 million times, people are tired of hearing it. I started out as a painter and discovered 2 years into my arts degree, I think I switched over to education in order not to starve to death. I began to realize that I was going to have to face the fact that I didn't have what it took to finish the degree, which I did do, but not immediately, and go out into the world and try to make a living as a painter. I didn't have that faith in my talent. And having been raised in working class poverty, I just wanted the hell out of that. I wanted to be able to buy the things I wanted and to do the things I wanted to do. And the only way that was going to happen was if I found a way to make a living. And you know how it was for girls in those days. You could be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary.
Yeah.
And so I became a
Right.
teacher.
Yeah.
So I loved it actually in some ways. Once I discovered disabled children, or as we called it in special ed, exceptional children of all sorts, and that I really could handle those kids, I could really enjoy being with them when most teachers would just get them away from me, sort of. I enjoyed teaching them, but I sure hated the bureaucracy. And that's why I went back to university finally. My marriage was falling apart. I was going to be a single parent. I did not want ever to have to deal with all that stuff in the education system ever again. And I had to be able to make a living at that time, even, and the way I could do it was by scholarship. I don't remember. Did I borrow money? I don't think I did, but I did manage to get back to university and not starve to death and started working. I was only planning for 1 year to get my, what do they call it? The certificate you get after a further year beyond the undergrad degree, but before you get your master's, and then got persuaded to stay on for my master's, which I both loved and hated at the same time, and then walked away before I was finished. I had been unable to paint since a traumatic incident happened to me when we were living in Halifax back in the 65 to 69. And I thought once I was married to Peter, I would start painting again. I never had a thought for anything else. And when I got down to the corrals to paint, to draw them one day with the big drawing pad and all my pencils and everything, I simply couldn't do it. I couldn't muster the intensity of interest in what I was doing. It was just gone. So what I had thought I would do, I couldn't do it. So I got quite interested. I got fascinated by the ranching culture I'd moved into and by nature itself in that context, that kind of nature. And I thought, maybe I can write magazine articles. And, eventually I did. I did journalism for a while, but I realized that that wasn't really what I wanted to do. What I dreamt of doing since I was a little kid and had utterly buried it was to write books. Books meant novels. So I started out trying to write a novel. And then after about 50 pages, I gave it up because I realized I didn't know what I was doing. And I thought maybe short stories will be easier. So I started writing short stories, which were not easier, but I could do it. And I wrote about 24 of them. And then one of them turned into my first novel.
Did you ever talk to Diane Warren about that switch from painting to writing?
No, I don't think I ever knew that Diane started as a painter. And I knew Diane fairly well. So surprised I didn't know. I knew her husband's a painter.
A terrific artist.
Yeah.
But she got a BFA, I guess, and started off as an artist. And something must have happened that urged her away from that and into writing.
Yeah, must have. Well, if I ever see her again, I might ask.
Yeah.
Well, that would be a
But
fascinating conversation as well.
I did not have an epiphanic moment, right? Have I? Is that right?
I'm so disappointed.
No, I have plenty of them, but not about writing.
The way Dave described that kind of ecstatic, quasi-spiritual experience with writing, it reminds me so much of the kinds of experiences that you write about in The Perfection of the Morning, connecting with nature. So I'd like to move into talking about nature writing because it's, I would say, central to both of your works.
Yeah.
So please talk about nature in your literary output.
I could start. You might have to stop me. I might go on too long. But when I was a kid, my parents had this big, smelly canvas tent, and they would take us out into the woods or someplace where we could camp. And the first engagement with nature that affected me was that my brother and I spent most of our time trying to catch squirrels in cardboard boxes and take them home with us. We were utterly failures, but that was very exciting. And then I discovered around the age of 9 or 10 that I was obsessed with snakes. And so when we went to BC, I remember collecting garter snakes. And when I had my first really terrific summer job, which was up at Lake Louise, I did a lot of hiking in the mountains, and I saw my first bears really up close without the comfort of a car and a highway to drive away. And anyway, the more I spent time camping and fishing and hiking, the more addicted I became to the outdoors. Well, what I think fascinated me the most of all was if you were persistent and if you noticed things, you could see amazing animals. And so in Saskatchewan, I have now seen 2 cougars. And in my early job as a stalking fish in the mountains, I saw an entire family of cougars.
Wow.
And I've had some very interesting encounters with grizzlies and wolves and black widow spiders. So when it came to writing a book about predatory creatures in the wild, those chapters just zipped right out of me. Writing has never been easy for me because I'm a perpetual rewriter. But that book, I think I started it. I did the research first, a lot of research, and then when I started writing, I think it probably took me less than a year to finish it.
Wow.
During the pandemic.
Mm.
I guess some books you're just born to write.
Sharon, your memoir, The Perfection of the Morning, is one of the most incredible pieces of nature writing I've ever read, and
Wow. Thank you.
it's imbued. Your all of your fiction has lots and lots of nature writing in it as well. And the title essay in your essay collection, "This Strange Invisible Air," is also very much about being open to and inspired by nature. So, tell us more about all that.
Okay. Unlike you were born and raised in a city, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, unlike David, I saw my first city on my 13th birthday. I was born in Nipawin, which just stopped being an outpost hospital of the Red Cross. So that tells you how far into the bush we were. And the only houses at that time were mostly freshly built log houses. We were on the land of the Swampy Cree, probably the people who are now the Red Earth Cree, but that's a guess on my part. So the government had just opened up that area to settlers, and it was wooded. And my father had a sawmill, and myself and my other three sisters were born in that outpost hospital, and we didn't leave there, and we were fully in the bush and living in a log house until I was, I think, 4. And then we moved down to a teeny little town so my older sister could start school. Although I know for a fact, because I've seen the documents, that my grandfather, they were a mile north of us, I think, same story. He was involved in the formation, which they were just working on with the government, of building a school for these new settlers' kids. So I started out life as a settler in the bush, in the northern Saskatchewan bush, although it's actually east central, and with Aboriginal Indigenous people, First Nations people around us, because they worked for my father. And that was in the time when the women didn't speak English yet. I know they lived one summer in teepees in a field next to our place. It was the view of First Nations people that there aren't a lot of Saskatchewan people left who lived in the middle of, I don't think. I just remember mountains of snow and the scary northern lights and trees everywhere and so on and so forth. And from there, we started moving from small town to small town until on my 13th birthday, we hit Saskatoon. And even at that time, even prior to that, in Melfort, where we lived for 5 years, children's daily lives were out in the fields and bushes and the streams and swamps that surrounded the town, or that we could find, or that in my imagination have probably grown to 100 times bigger than they actually were. And then we hit the city, and we did head out, I remember more than once, toward the sand when the sand was still there, because it was the wild, it was bushes and trees and the river running by. But then I blotted that all out. Not a good past to have for somebody who was aiming to become a glamorous, sophisticated, intellectual type person, which kind of fell by the wayside between divorces and one thing and another. And so when I finally married Peter in 76, which was the year you went off to get your master's degree in Texas, right?
No, the year I was doing research at the University of Texas.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Well, that was the year I married Peter and went south too, but not quite so far, just to southwest Saskatchewan. And it was as if I was reborn. I was partly shedding all the things I disliked about the university, which was not the learning. But it seemed to me in my universe that learning was the last thing that people got excited about at the university or focused really on. I mean, I was teaching the last 2 years, and wow, did not like that. I mean, I liked the teaching, I liked the students, but I did not like the apparatus that you had to be a part of, even though you were the lowest person on the ladder. And when I went over the last hill on my drive down from Saskatoon, and the sky opened up and the land opened up, and there were not houses everywhere and hardly any people, I just thought I'd been recreated in paradise. I never wanted to go back to what I'd left behind. I did go back a year later because they were kind of nudging me to finish up my thesis. And I think I lasted through one meeting and I walked away again. No, thank you. And then my professor, who was my boss and the head of the whole thing, he came down to the ranch to talk to me about why I had left with his new wife. And I wouldn't tell him, I wouldn't even talk about it. I just kept changing the subject till his wife started laughing, said she doesn't want to talk about it. And then he told me that he had written to the president of the university at that time and had asked him to give me my master's degree. When this happened, I think I must have published some books then, otherwise, why would he bother? And the president had ignored him, but he tried. So, I didn't want to go back to that life. Although when I get invited to speak, which is rarely at universities, I never say no. And I love being back at the U of S campus. I spent 9 years on that campus, and going back just as
9 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. 5 years getting a BA, BEd, and then 4 more getting that post-grad diploma, and then working for another year on my master's degree while I was 2 years working as a low-level faculty and getting paid less than I had gotten paid as a school teacher to do that. That's how bad it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
I also want to celebrate Dave's gorgeous nature writing in all of his fiction. So nature is very, very important in all of the writing that I have read, and I've now read quite a chunk of it, Dave. So you are a masterful writer of nature scenes in your fiction that is supposedly about people, but often it's as much about nature as it is anything else.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yay, rattlesnakes.
But our last topic is age. You are two very productive, brilliant writers in your early 80s. Talk about getting older as a writer and getting wiser. I don't know, getting better. Talk about age and the writing life.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The first thing I could say is that even though it's harder for me to write, the older I get, it takes longer to finish a novel. I mean, that's heavy lifting to me. It doesn't take quite so long to write nonfiction books. They kind of come easier to me for some reason. But writing now is more laborious, and I can't put in the hours anymore. I used to put in full days when I was into a novel. Now I might put in 3 hours a day writing, but the writing itself is absolutely as important to me right now at the age of 83 as it was when I first started back in the good old Austin, Texas. Some of the excitement is still there, and the need to be writing is still there. I'm one of those people who can't not write.
Well, I agree with most of what Dave said. It's true, it's harder, takes longer, and I can't last as long at my desk. But I think for me, the struggle is that I get so lambasted for being a realist in a postmodern world that it's kind of made me question how I do things and whether I should be thinking in more postmodern terms And yet I read works by, for example, Washington Black by S.E. Edugan, and I just can't believe that, I'm not saying she's not a good writer. I don't mean that. It's just the stuff that happens in the novel. I just think this is childhood fairy tale stuff, Why do we prefer that over the hard reality of the struggle of being a human being? I think, well, I could do that, but my heart wouldn't be in it. Why would I fake it? I think I have to keep doing what I do. I also just recently read a novel by Charles Frazier, who wrote Cold Mountain. Trackers, I think it's called. It's not postmodern. It's also not a big hit. Both those writers had National Book Awards, I believe. I mean, Paulette, Jiles, and him. Anyway, I may have to finish in the realist mode because that's where I live. That's where my heart is, where
Sure.
my consciousness is. Thank you. And stop paying attention to these, to quote Spiro Agnew, nobody remembers him, I'm sure, except David.
I
You
do.
do.
I do, yeah.
Pointy-headed intellectuals say, by the way, Salman Rushdie is one of the ones who most takes that position up until the knife attack. Have you noticed how silent he's been since then? Of course, he was a year recovering, but this was one of the most privileged persons in the writing community around the world. Never had a problem. Everything, he was so brilliant, went so well for him. And then the untenable happens to him. And he's been, other than his not very good book about it called Knife, he hasn't had anything much to say that I've ever heard about.
I
Hasn't
haven't
written
heard.
another book, which says to me, hard reality was what that knife was. And maybe he's doing the opposite thinking to what I've been doing now. Maybe it's time to think more about what life is for real people in real places at this moment in history, this very, very difficult moment in history.
Well, I think Saskatchewan writers are uniquely situated to keep writing in the realist mode. Dave, you have a theory about Saskatchewan being the place where realism makes the most sense from a literary point of view. Can you maybe finish us off with that?
I forgot I had committed that thought to writing. Terrifying when they come back to haunt you. Yes, I think that even in the city of Saskatoon, you could feel the rough edge of life. Yeah, sometimes the winters are between 5 and 6 months long. There's certainly wealth in Saskatoon, but it's nothing like the wealth of big cities. We might have wealthy physicians, shall we say, and lawyers, but it's a fairly slow economy, a kind of basic bare minimum city that we live in, almost a lunch bucket city. And I think if you're going to be lured into the literary trends of whatever they may be, it helps if you're surrounded by a very big bohemian society and a very pervasive university society. It seems to me that most of the people who veered away from realism, unlike Ray Carver, by the way, they were either professors of English or they were professorial in nature, and they loved theory. And it seems to me when novelists veer into theory, it's sort of like being in class again, being lectured to. To me, I mean, a lot of people
And
would
me.
disagree. Yeah.
And me. And that, to wrap up, is why you are two of my very most favorite writers. And this has been an absolutely delightful conversation with two of my very most favorite people. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you too, Shawn, very much.
Absolutely.
You are the bestest literary bloggist in the whole damn territory, and keep up the good work.
Well, I've got good
Yeah.
material, don't I? Good subjects
Well,
to work with.
very grateful to you for doing what you do and giving us an audience that's spread wider than, as Canadian writers we might otherwise.
Yeah, I've got 5,000 subscribers from all around the world. Most of my subscribers
Wow.
are not from Canada, actually.
Wow.
So that gives it a bit more reach from out yonder. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. And it was great. I enjoyed it muchly.
You
Bye-bye.
betcha.
Well, let's do it again.